The morning sunlight streaming through the kitchen windows of the Atlanta townhouse illuminated the steam rising from the French press on the counter, where Jasmine Miller was preparing breakfast for a household that had become a minefield of cruelty disguised as tradition. She was 6 months pregnant, her hands moving carefully over the hot coffee pot because sudden movements made her lower back ache, when she heard Marcus's footsteps on the stairs accompanied by Vanessa's sharp laughter. Marcus's mistress had been living in their home for 3 weeks now, installed in the guest room under the pretense of needing a place to stay, while his first wife Diana watched everything with an expression Jasmine couldn't read. Jasmine poured the first cup carefully, knowing Marcus liked it scalding hot, and was turning to set it on the table when she heard Vanessa's voice cut through the kitchen's relative peace. "Look at her waddling around like she owns the place. Second wife trying to act like she matters." Marcus laughed at his mistress's cruelty, and Jasmine felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came from swallowing words that would only make things worse. She set the coffee on the table and turned back to the counter, trying to become invisible the way she'd learned to do over the past 8 months of this marriage that had revealed itself to be a trap. That's when Marcus picked up the cup of boiling coffee she'd just poured and threw it directly at her face and chest, the scalding liquid hitting her neck and soaking through her maternity dress to burn the skin of her swollen belly. Jasmine's scream tore through the house as she fell to her knees, her hands instinctively going to her stomach, to the baby, while Marcus stood over her and Vanessa laughed like this was entertainment she'd paid for. Diana appeared in the doorway, took one look at Jasmine on the floor with coffee burning through her clothes, and walked away without saying a word. If that opening made your stomach turn, if you're already feeling the rage and the desperate need for justice, then you need to hit that like button right now. Share this with everyone who needs to see what happens when abusers think they're untouchable, when cruelty gets mistaken for power, when a pregnant woman decides that survival means fighting back with every tool the law provides. Subscribe to Acts of Depth because we tell the stories about the moment when victims become survivors, when documentation becomes evidence, when the abused gather enough courage to walk away and make sure their abuser faces consequences that destroy the comfortable life built on someone else's pain. Now let me take you back to understand how Jasmine ended up in this nightmare and why what she did next would cost Marcus everything he valued more than the women he had harmed. Jasmine Miller had met Marcus Williams 18 months earlier at a church community event in Atlanta, where he'd presented himself as a successful entrepreneur and devout man looking for a wife who understood African tradition and the value of family. He'd been charming and attentive, had courted her properly with flowers and respectful conversation, and had been honest from the beginning that he had a first wife named Diana and that he was looking for a second wife because his faith and culture supported polygamy. Jasmine had been 26 years old, working as a nurse at Grady Memorial Hospital, living with her mother and younger siblings after her father's death had left them struggling financially. She'd grown up in a household where her mother had worked 3 jobs to keep them fed, where education was valued but expensive, where the church community had been their safety net when things got desperate. When Marcus had explained that he wanted a plural marriage where both wives would be cared for and respected, where he'd provide financial security and family structure, Jasmine had been skeptical, but also exhausted from years of shouldering responsibilities that felt crushing. Marcus had seemed successful and stable. He'd talked about building a family business that would employ the whole household. He'd promised that his first wife Diana was on board with the arrangement and that they'd all work together to create something stronger than a traditional marriage. He'd quoted scripture and tradition and made it sound like joining his household was an opportunity rather than the trap it would reveal itself to be. The warning signs had been there from the beginning, but Jasmine had been too hopeful and too financially desperate to see them clearly. Marcus had insisted the marriage ceremony be private, just immediate family, and when Jasmine had asked to meet Diana beforehand to make sure the first wife was truly comfortable with the arrangement, Marcus had made excuses about Diana being busy with work. When they'd finally met the day before the wedding, Diana had been cold but polite, saying all the right words about welcoming Jasmine to the family, but with eyes that suggested she'd made peace with a situation she hated. Jasmine had married Marcus in a small ceremony that wasn't legally recognized since he was already married to Diana, but that was presented as spiritually and culturally valid. She'd moved into the townhouse that Marcus owned, taking the smaller bedroom on the second floor while Diana kept the primary suite. And within a week, Jasmine had understood that she hadn't joined a family. She'd entered a hierarchy where Diana resented her existence. Marcus enjoyed having two women competing for his approval, and any notion of equality or respect had been a lie told to get her to sign away her independence. Marcus's successful business turned out to be a series of failed ventures funded by maxing out credit cards and borrowing from family. The financial security he'd promised was actually financial chaos that he expected both wives to help manage by working full-time jobs and handing over their paychecks. The beautiful vision of collaborative family he'd sold was actually a household where Marcus pitted the two women against each other, where he punished perceived slights by withdrawing attention or resources, where Diana had learned to survive by becoming cruel to Jasmine to maintain her position as first wife. Jasmine had discovered she was pregnant 3 months into the marriage. She'd thought maybe a baby would improve things, would give her a secure role in the household, would make Marcus treat her with the care and protection she'd been promised. Instead, the pregnancy had made everything worse. Marcus had started complaining about the medical bills, despite Jasmine still working full-time at the hospital until her doctor put her on bed rest. Diana had become more openly hostile, making comments about Jasmine trying to secure her position by getting pregnant first, even though Diana had been married to Marcus for 7 years without children. And Marcus had started spending more time away from the house, eventually revealing that he had a girlfriend named Vanessa, who he was considering making his third wife. When Jasmine had objected, had pointed out that he couldn't even provide for the two wives he already had, Marcus had slapped her across the face and told her that questioning his decisions was disrespectful and grounds for divorce. Jasmine had been terrified of divorce because it would mean losing the health insurance she needed for prenatal care and returning to her mother's already overcrowded apartment while pregnant and unemployed. So she'd stayed quiet and endured while Marcus brought Vanessa around more frequently, while the mistress openly mocked both wives, while the household became a pressure cooker of resentment and cruelty that was building toward an explosion. The boiling coffee incident was that explosion. And what Jasmine did in the 30 seconds after Marcus burned her would set in motion consequences he'd never imagined. Jasmine stayed on the kitchen floor for approximately 10 seconds after the boiling coffee hit her skin, her hands on her belly checking for movement from the baby while the burns on her neck and chest screamed with pain. Then she stood up slowly and walked past Marcus and Vanessa to the downstairs bathroom. She locked the door. She turned on the cold water in the sink and soaked a towel, pressing it against the burns on her neck while she pulled out her phone with shaking hands. She didn't call her mother. She didn't call her church. She called 911 and reported a domestic violence assault on a pregnant woman requiring immediate medical attention and police response. Her voice was steady when she gave the address and described what had happened. "My husband threw boiling coffee on me. I'm 6 months pregnant. I have second-degree burns on my neck and chest. I need an ambulance, and I need police because I'm not safe in this house." The dispatcher kept her on the line while dispatching emergency services, asking questions about her condition and whether her attacker was still in the home. Jasmine answered calmly and clearly while she used her phone's camera to photograph the burns on her skin, the coffee-soaked dress, the reflection in the mirror showing her face streaked with tears, but her eyes focused and determined. She'd been a nurse for 4 years. She knew how to document injuries. She knew what evidence looked like. And she knew that the difference between being a victim who suffered in silence and a survivor who escaped was often just the willingness to make the call she'd just made. The ambulance arrived in 8 minutes. The police arrived in 10. Jasmine unlocked the bathroom door when she heard the EMTs calling for her, walking out past Marcus, who was now panicking and trying to explain that it had been an accident, that the coffee had spilled, that his wife was overreacting. The EMTs took one look at the burns blistering across Jasmine's neck and chest and immediately began treatment while calling ahead to Grady Memorial to prepare for an incoming pregnant patient with thermal burns requiring assessment for both mother and fetus. The police officers separated Marcus, Diana, and Vanessa, taking statements from each while Jasmine was being loaded into the ambulance. One of the officers, a black woman in her 40s named Officer Washington, came to speak with Jasmine before she was transported. Mrs. Williams, I need to know what happened here. Take your time. Jasmine told her everything, not just about the coffee, but about the 8 months of escalating abuse, about Marcus slapping her when she questioned his decisions, about being forced to hand over her paycheck, about the three-person household becoming four when the mistress moved in, about Diana's complicity in the abuse, about fearing for her unborn child's safety. Officer Washington took notes and then said something that would prove crucial. I'm going to take photographs as evidence. And I'm going to recommend that the district attorney charge your husband with aggravated assault and cruelty to children since you're pregnant. You need to know that you have options. You don't have to go back to that house. There are resources. Will you let me connect you with a domestic violence advocate? Jasmine said yes to everything. Yes to photographs. Yes to pressing charges. Yes to resources. Yes to never going back to a house where her husband threw boiling coffee on her pregnant body to impress his mistress. At Grady Memorial Hospital, the same hospital where Jasmine had worked until her bed rest began, her colleagues took care of her with the kind of fierce protectiveness that healthcare workers showed when one of their own became a patient. The burns were treated and bandaged. The baby's heartbeat was monitored and found to be strong despite the trauma. The attending physician, Dr. Patricia Chen, who'd worked with Jasmine in the ER, documented every injury with the thoroughness of someone who knew these records would end up in court. Jasmine, I'm documenting this as assault. Second-degree burns consistent with hot liquid thrown with force. Fetal monitoring shows tachycardia suggesting stress response to maternal trauma. You're going to be okay physically, but I need you to understand that staying in that environment risks both your life and your baby's. Do you have somewhere safe to go? Jasmine didn't. Her mother's apartment was too small and too far from the hospital for the high-risk monitoring she'd now require. She had friends but didn't want to burden them or put them in Marcus's path when he came looking for her. Dr. Chen made a call to the hospital's social services department, and within an hour, Jasmine had been connected with a domestic violence shelter that specialized in supporting pregnant women and had medical staff on site. She'd be admitted that evening after discharge from the ER. She'd have a safe place to stay, counseling services, legal advocacy, and protection from the man who'd burned her. For the first time in 8 months, Jasmine felt like she could breathe. The domestic violence advocate who met with Jasmine while she was still in the ER was a woman named Keisha Roberts, who'd been doing this work for 15 years and had seen every variation of abuse the human imagination could devise. Keisha sat beside Jasmine's hospital bed and explained what would happen next with the kind of calm expertise that made Jasmine feel less alone. The police have arrested Marcus on charges of aggravated assault and cruelty to children. He'll be held pending a bail hearing. You'll have the opportunity to request a restraining order, which I strongly recommend. The advocate from the DA's office will be in touch about pressing criminal charges and testifying if this goes to trial. And we need to talk about your living situation, your finances, and your safety plan. Over the next 2 hours, Keisha helped Jasmine map out a path forward that had seemed impossible when she'd been trapped in Marcus's house. The shelter would provide housing for up to 6 months, long enough for Jasmine to have her baby and recover. The hospital would continue her prenatal care at no cost through their charity care program. The legal aid clinic would help her file for divorce and establish custody and child support, even though the marriage wasn't legally recognized, using common law and paternity statutes to protect her and the baby. There were job retraining programs for when she was ready to work again. There was emergency financial assistance for immediate needs. There was a whole ecosystem of support that existed specifically for women like Jasmine, who'd been brave enough to call 911 and say, "I'm not safe." Jasmine cried when she understood she wasn't alone, that leaving Marcus wasn't impossible, that choosing herself and her baby over the nightmare household she'd been trapped in was not only possible but supported. Marcus was denied bail at his hearing when the prosecutor presented the photographs of Jasmine's burns, the fetal monitoring showing stress response, and the police report documenting Jasmine's statement about ongoing domestic violence. The judge looked at Marcus and said something that would become crucial to everything that followed. "Mr. Williams, you assaulted a pregnant woman in your care by throwing boiling liquid on her with enough force to cause second-degree burns. This wasn't an accident. Multiple witnesses confirm it was intentional. You present a clear danger to the victim and to the unborn child. Bail is denied. You'll remain in custody pending trial. Marcus's attorney objected, but the ruling stood. Marcus was taken back to jail where he'd remain for the 4 months until his trial. During those 4 months, Jasmine lived at the shelter and rebuilt her life piece by piece. She attended counseling sessions where she processed the trauma of the abuse and the guilt she felt for staying as long as she had. She learned that she wasn't responsible for Marcus's violence, that his choice to hurt her wasn't caused by anything she'd done wrong. She met other women who'd escaped similar situations, some with children, some pregnant, all of them rebuilding with the same combination of courage and exhaustion. She gave birth to a healthy baby girl she named Hope, delivered at Grady Memorial by Dr. Chen, surrounded by nurses who'd become friends. And she filed for full custody of her daughter along with a request for child support that would require Marcus to pay even from jail. The legal system was slow, but it was moving. Marcus's trial was scheduled for September. The DA's office was pursuing the maximum sentence, and Jasmine was preparing to testify. The trial lasted 3 days. Jasmine sat in the witness box wearing a professional dress borrowed from Keisha's closet, holding her 3-month-old daughter who'd been allowed in court as evidence of the cruelty to children charge, and told her story to a jury of 12 people who would decide Marcus's fate. She described meeting him, the promises he'd made, the progressive revelation that those promises were lies, the escalating abuse culminating in the boiling coffee thrown at her pregnant body. The defense attorney tried to make her look vindictive, suggested she was exaggerating, implied she was trying to take revenge on a man who'd simply made a mistake. But the photographs didn't lie. The medical records didn't lie. The police reports didn't lie. And when Officer Washington testified about finding Jasmine locked in a bathroom with burns blistering across her skin, while Marcus claimed it had been an accident, the jury's expressions suggested they weren't buying the defense's story. Diana was called to testify. She tried to protect Marcus, claiming she hadn't seen what happened, that Jasmine was unstable and prone to hurting herself for attention. But under cross-examination, the prosecutor got her to admit she'd seen Marcus slap Jasmine before, had heard him threaten her, had witnessed Vanessa mocking Jasmine while Marcus encouraged it. Diana's testimony meant to help Marcus actually sealed his fate by establishing a pattern of abuse. Vanessa didn't testify, having disappeared from Atlanta when she realized Marcus was actually going to face consequences. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. When they returned, Marcus stood to hear the verdict while Jasmine sat in the gallery holding Hope and barely breathing. Guilty on all counts, aggravated assault, cruelty to children. The judge scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks later, and at that hearing, Marcus received 12 years in prison with eligibility for parole after 8. The judge's statement from the bench was scathing. "Mr. Williams, you exploited cultural and religious concepts to build a household where you could abuse multiple women with impunity. You financially exploited them. You physically abused them. And when one of them was pregnant with your child, you threw boiling coffee on her to impress your mistress. This court will not tolerate such conduct. The sentence reflects society's commitment to protecting pregnant women and holding abusers accountable regardless of what cultural or religious justifications they claim." Marcus was led away in handcuffs while Jasmine held her daughter and felt something she hadn't felt in 18 months. Safe. The nightmare was over. The man who'd hurt her would be in prison for years, and she had a life to build that wasn't defined by his cruelty. Leaving the courthouse that day, Jasmine ran into Diana, who was crying on the steps. "He's gone. What am I supposed to do now?" Diana's voice was plaintive, like she expected Jasmine to comfort her. Jasmine looked at this woman who'd stood by while Marcus abused her, who'd walked away when she'd been burned, who'd testified in his defense even after everything.